Bandy, and this is my channel, Bandy's Books. It is January 31st, the very last day of the month, so I thought it was time that we shoot a wrap-up video. I'm going to be including some statistics on what I read this month. I'm going to go over each book just in brief detail. We're not going to talk about it extensively because I did read a lot of books this month, and obviously I don't want to keep you here for 2 hours. So with that being said, let's get into some statistics to start. This month, I read 23 books in total. I did much better at reading books on my TBR. I did stray from it a little bit, and I blame that mostly on the books that I checked out from the library. So I think I cleared off a pretty good chunk. This is probably the most that I've cleared off of a TBR so far since starting book social media. I'm pretty happy with that. But I'm definitely be working on next month being better about that and trying not to check out books as much so that I don't get distracted from the books that I'm actually trying to get done with. For those 23 books in total, I read 8,930 pages. That's also a pretty solid number. I'd say, that the average book length was pretty on par with what I normally tend to read, and that averaged out to about 372 pages per book. Some of them were much shorter, some of them were much longer, but comes out to an average there. My shortest book of the month was A Spindle Splintered by Alex E. Harrow. That came in at 128 pages. It's like a little novella. And my longest book of the month was The Starlight C by Erin Morgenstern, which came out to 592 pages. I am very happy with the reading that I did. I think that this was a pretty solid month. I am rated pretty much everything between 3 to 5 stars, and most of the books that were in the 3-star category were on a high 3-star. So I was pretty pleased with that. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get into it. I'll go over my favorite book of the month and my least favorite book of the month also during the book description process. So 3-star reads were all pretty high end of the 3-star reads this month, except for one. I had 8. So 8 total 3-star reads this month. That's not bad. 3-star for me, again, is a book that's solid. There's maybe some things that I would edit or change, but it's not enough that I didn't want to read the book. I didn't consider DNFing it. Just mostly found myself maybe wishing for the pacing to be changed a little, or some editing or things like that, So none of these books are bad by any means. One of them was solidly my least favorite, and it was probably the only one that was on the low end of a 3. So to start, I had A Lesson in Vengeance by Victoria Lee. This was probably closer to 3.5 for me. It was pretty interesting. It is a story about a girl whose girlfriend dies in kind of mysterious circumstances at this boarding school, and due to that she leaves the boarding school for a year, takes kind of a sabbatical, restores her mind and everything, and then goes back to school. She was involved in some witchcraft and history of witchcraft in the school, and so when she goes back, everybody's afraid that if she reinvests in that subject, it's going to re-trigger all these issues she was having. But she gets dragged back into that by this new girl at school that's super popular and super into this witchish history. So it was good. It was a good mystery, well written. I think my biggest issue was that I felt like the pacing was maybe dragging a little bit towards the middle to the end. I think it started out really well. The flow of information initially was good. I don't know, I wish it would have been a little more even throughout. And then I did find the plot to get slightly convoluted towards the end as well. I notice in thrillers, a lot of times people try to pack too many plot twists into the story, and that was the case with this book. I felt like there was just 1 or 2 too many. I think that the bones of the story was really good. I think just by the effort that the author was trying to put in to make it surprising, that's kind of what screwed it up. I think had she just stuck to 1 or 2 simple reveals, I think it would have been a better book for it. But overall, not mad at it. I definitely wouldn't tell you not to read it. But I mean, it wouldn't be my first recommendation either. And then we had Not a Happy Family. That was a checkout for me by Sherry LaPena. Same thing with that one. It was a story about a dysfunctional family. Parents die, leaving a huge fortune, and all the kids and an aunt are there to duke out who's getting what. Same thing. It's a murder mystery. There's 5 suspects, and it just kept twisting back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it's yeah, you want to keep your readers on their toes. That's the point of a psychological thriller. But at a certain point, it becomes unbelievable when you twist it that much. So for me, that was my core problem with this one as well. I would definitely have preferred if they had twisted it less and just focused on making a couple of the twists really, really extraordinary. Next up was Beautiful World, Where Are You? This was also another book that I checked out. I have heard a lot about this particular author and that she doesn't use punctuations or quotation marks or anything in her writing, that it's almost possible to tell when a character is speaking, etc. I did find the writing style a little bit annoying. It was not my preference to not have punctuation. I think it is particularly frustrating when you're trying to discern the dialogue and there's no quotations to let you know. It's different if you're like listening to it maybe, but reading it on paperwork, it's, yeah, not my favorite. And I found the characters a little annoying, but I think they're supposed to be annoying. They come off kind of pretentious and snobby, and they're just really frustrating. Like, there's two relationships going on, and it's always a are they, aren't they kind of a situation. Nobody's ever sure. It's just, I don't love that dynamic. I'm not a big romance reader, and I especially don't love like really toxic romance, and I think that's kind of what this was, is a lot of toxic romance. Next was Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. This one for me was also about a 3.5. I enjoyed it. I do love fantasy. This is a YA fantasy. I do like the dystopian thing. I love the strong female characters. However, my main bone to pick with this story was that it reminded me so much of the Hunger Games. So much. You have the angsty girl at the beginning of the story that has to do something against the law to feed her family, who apparently all are incapable of doing anything themselves. In the Hunger Games, I feel like we're presented with rational reasons of why the family can't do anything. But in this story, there's a mom, a dad, and like 3 siblings and a sister, and everybody's just apparently useless. I don't know, it gave me really strong Katniss vibes initially. She's kind of bitter and angry about her position. She feels like she's the black sheep of the family. She just has that angst, that same angsty feel that Katniss has at the beginning of the Hunger Games. And then she's sent into a world where she doesn't really belong, just like Katniss is sent to the capital, and all of a sudden she has to learn how to be polite, and she's dressed up and made to look a certain way and made to act a certain way, and this is all very similar to how Katniss is treated in the Hunger Games. And then, without giving you major spoilers, it doesn't follow exactly the same narrative, but eventually she's forced into a situation where she has to fight. And that also heavily reminded me of the Hunger Games. And so I kept reading this going, am I the only one that's noticing this? And when I looked online afterwards to see if I was crazy, I noticed that a lot in the reviews as well. I do hear that from the next couple books in the series, it tends to diverge from the Hunger Games, but definitely the first one is reminiscent. So if you're a Hunger Games fan, you may love this, or you may just be like me and like, what the hell is this, just a complete ripoff? But overall, it's like not bad writing. The story is interesting. The characters are interesting. It's just, you know, be prepared to reminisce. Another one that was checked out was Eat, Pray, Love. So Eat, Pray, Love for me was kind of a disappointing book. I love, love, love travel. I've been to 25 countries. I hope to eventually someday have visited every single country in the world, and then maybe repeat them, because I mean, even if you visit every country, there's never ever a time in which you'll have seen everything in the world. But before I get into like a huge tangent, so I thought I would love Eat, Pray, Love, because you know, it's a ladies' travel memoir, but I didn't. I think for me, it kind of fell on a lot of things that I think of as cliches now, and maybe if I had read Eat, Pray, Love when it first came out, before some of those cliches were so heavy, maybe I would have liked it more. But I think, like, because I've heard people say so many times now, I'm having the Eat, Pray, Love moment, you know, and like Instagram in terms of travelgram is just flooded with pictures of Bali and, you know, girls in bikinis doing yoga and stuff like that, and it just, I don't know, that's the same kind of vibe that I got from Eat, Pray, Love. It wasn't badly written. The stories of her travels were very interesting. I thought the parts about her spiritual awakening and these moments of revelation that she had were very interesting as well. I just, like I said, I just like a different style of travel. I like a different style of travel memoir. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't my thing necessarily. And I read a book called The Benefits of Being an Octopus. I did not realize that this was a kid's book, and when I say kid's book, I mean like maybe a middle grade book. I started listening to it on audiobook on Libby because the cover looked so cool, and I love octopuses. I'm a scuba diver, and I love everything that has to do with the ocean. And so I was listening to it, and all of a sudden I realized, like, hey, this seems kind of like young, And I mean, not young adult young, like young, but I was already invested into the story, so I'm like, let's just write it out. It was only about a 5 or 6 hour audiobook. But it's basically about a young girl who's living in a trailer with her mom. They are facing pretty severe poverty, and her mom is basically in a toxic relationship. Her partner is very emotionally abusive. He's not physically abusive, but very emotionally abusive. He is gaslighting her, very manipulative, narcissistic, and it gets to a point that the daughter recognizes those patterns and recognizes that things are not right in her life. And she's simultaneously dealing with a struggle at school where she's so anxious about speaking and answering questions and asking questions that she just never talks. And somehow she gets enrolled into a debate club, and that kind of brings out her ability to think and challenge things and learn to speak for herself. The moment, or the reason that the book is called The Benefits of Being the Octopus is because her debate subject, one of her first debate subjects, is to convince someone that your favorite animal is the best animal. And so that becomes a running theme throughout the story. I think that, you know, some potentially pretty difficult topics to address with children are addressed pretty well in this book. It does talk about gaslighting, it does talk about emotional abuse, it does talk about value and worth. And I think that this book does, and it talks a lot about poverty too. And I think this book does this in a tasteful way where it would give you enough as a child to kind of understand it, to really maybe challenge your own thoughts, but not necessarily so much that it's like obscene for a child to read. Very tastefully done. I think, you know, it was a solid 3.5 for me, even as an adult, and even as somebody who doesn't usually typically read like very young children's books. And then I read The Witch Haven, another book that I had on loan. That one was also just okay for me. It was about 3.5. It's a young woman who is living back in the day, like I want to say like 1920s, maybe even late 1800s, I can't remember. But she is spirited away from New York City to what she's told is a sanitarium for insane women, and it ends up being a school of magic. And in the school of magic, she's introduced to a bunch of women. It's all girls, and they're taught things like household chore spells and knitting spells and sewing spells and cleaning spells, and basically schooled on manners and proper decorum for a young woman in society. And it's basically like magic plus finishing school. But our main character comes to find out that there's a lot more to magic than just that there's all sorts of things you can do with magic, and it seems that the school is kind of purposefully preventing the young girls from learning any of that type of magic. It was pretty interesting. Same thing, about 3.5. I wasn't really mad at it, but it just wasn't like, wow. It wasn't the most original thing I'd ever read. There's some issues with, you know, plot points in the story. Kind of gets a little draggy at certain points, but all in all, you know, an enjoyable read. Like if you're looking for a witchy kind of a book to listen to or read around Halloween time, it would be, you know, perfectly decent spot on a list somewhere. And then my most disappointing book of the month. Let me get it. I picked this up at a little free library. I threw it on the TBR because I was reading all fantasy this month, and I get distracted when I pick out books, so I picked out another one. I took this with me on a trip because I thought it would be like an easy read, you know, nothing crazy deep to get into. I was right on that. It wasn't like the deepest read in the world. It is a dystopian fiction or fantasy sort of a thing. It does have a strong female character. She, at the start of the book, is in a prison. She doesn't remember exactly how long she's been in the prison. She doesn't know why she's being kept there. She thinks it has to do with this power. She has this power that if she touches people, she kills them. So think like Rogue in X-Men. And then a young man is shoved into a cell with her, and eventually they become friends. Turns out this friend that she's made is really a secret soldier for the bad guy. Bad guy seems utterly fascinated with her and decides that he wants her at his side, and starts dressing her up like a doll and taking her around and exhibiting her power for his soldiers. The concept isn't horrible, but in terms of dystopian fic, I think this was probably one of the weakest ones I've read. For me, this one was really evidently like YA, like heavily YA. Usually when I read YA fantasy, you know, sometimes it can be a little juvenile, but for the most part, I find that they're more mature, I guess. The way that the world works, this girl's reaction to all the things that she's been through, the way that the bad guy's behaving, it just, a lot of it didn't really make sense to me. I think, again, like I said, that the bones of the story are good. I don't think that the concept is bad at all. I just didn't love the execution. I know that this story goes on for another 5 or 6 or 7 books. I don't know exactly how many. And I've heard good things about the series. I personally probably won't read any more of them. But let me know in the comments if you've read any of this series and does it get better? Is it just the first book? Should I keep going, or is it like just go ahead and write it off? Most of my reads this month fell into the 4-star category. There was quite a few of them. So we'll go through them one by one. A Song Below Water was one of the ones that was in my 4-star category. This was a really interesting book. So I didn't know what to expect with this. It looks like very much mermaidy, and so I was kind of expecting a modern mermaid tale. And in some ways it was a modern mermaid tale, but not in the way I was expecting. I don't know if that made any sense. The 2 characters are Ify and Tavia. And Ify is a siren, I think. Or was it Tavia? Tavia is the siren, sorry. So Tavia is a siren. She knows she's a siren. Sirens come in the maternal side of the family. Paternal side of the family. Like, it passes from grandmother to granddaughter. Being a siren is viewed as dangerous because sirens can use their voice to manipulate humans. So humans fear sirens and persecute them. There was a lot of parallels in this book to Black Lives Matter and the way Black people are treated in this country and how sirens are treated in this book. This book actually touches a lot on how Black people are treated. There's a point where one of the main characters is pulled over and has a very tense exchange with police officers. There's Black Lives Matter protests, things like that. And she kind of just incorporates the siren part of it into this particular plot line. So in the book, we're told that sirens can only be Black people. They force sirens to wear these like shock collars, so if they try to use their siren call to manipulate anyone, they're literally shocked. It's super inhumane. The whole thing is presented in a really interesting way. And there's other creatures besides just sirens. There are gorgons and gargoyles and selkies and all sorts of different creatures. It's very interesting how they're incorporated. I mean, it's just like basically the normal world, how things are now. It's just if these creatures were incorporated. And she gives voice to each creature in a really unique way. They're all very different, but the story follows reality, and that's what I thought was really fascinating, because often, you know, when you're reading fantasy, it's a complete fantasy. You're not trying to imagine the fantasy in reality. This is also YA, and I do think that this, you can tell that this is YA. Not that it's like entirely like super juvenile, but there are just some points in the plot where you're like, yeah, okay, this is got that little bit of YA vibe to it. But I thought it was really excellent. I love that this touched on so many relevant topics. I love that it covered the Black Lives Matter protests and how Black people are treated by police, how society tends to treat people that they view as different as like scary or threatening when really they just don't have the information. There's just a lot of really, really relevant topics in here, and I thought it was presented in a really beautiful way. And a way that I think would really make it understandable if you're a younger reader and you're maybe a little unfamiliar with some of those topics. I think that this would be a good starting place because it makes it very palatable and digestible. So definitely a good recommendation there. Next on my 4 stars was another book I checked out. It was Waitlisted, Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So I, for the longest time, had never read anything by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I read Evelyn Hugo back in December. That was enjoyable, so I thought I'd give another one a try, so I got Daisy Jones and the Six. Daisy Jones and the Six is about a solo singer and a band, and they combine forces to create an album. Think kind of Fleetwood Mac. Daisy Jones is a famous, like, notorious LA party girl turned singer. The Six is a band that's, you know, minorly successful. They do a collaboration, the collaboration blows up, and then everybody starts demanding that they become one band. This whole book is about the dynamics of the band. So you're getting the history of the band and the album that they produced together, but from the different point of views of all the different people in the band. So there's 7 people in the band, you hear from all of them, and all about what was going on at different points, and it kind of progresses little by little through each story. It's very interesting. I liked how it was presented. The only real knock on it for me was that Daisy Jones, the main character, was just so extraordinarily selfish and kind of pretentious, and it just it was hard sometimes to read her point of view. I mean, I kind of think that she's supposed to be that way, I think that, you know, we're supposed to view her as flawed and kind of pretentious and snotty and all that, and having made mistakes, but I don't know, she kind of grates on me a little bit, and so did the other like lead singer, I forget his name, but he was also very kind of pretentious, but in a very different way. So overall, the whole story was really good, but I think there was little things here and there that kind of grated for me. And then I read A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. This was my first book by Amor Towles, and I really enjoyed it. This is about a gentleman in communist Russia. He is part of like the old oligarchy, and he was like a duke or something like that, and then communists take over, and because he has so many connections, instead of being executed or sent to a gulag to like be forced to work, they just allow him to live out the rest of his life, but locked in a hotel. So they pick a really nice hotel. It's a hotel that he loved and frequented, but he has a room there and he's not allowed to leave the hotel. And it just kind of follows his day-to-day living, his hijinks and shenanigans, and it's really interesting. He makes observations on the staff, makes friends with guests. He knows everybody, so he kind of becomes like a de facto greeter or like a maitre d' in the hotel. And it's just a really interesting book. I think that I also really enjoyed like the focus on food and wine and stuff like that. There's a lot where he's talking about these beautiful dishes and how they should be cooked properly, and you can just really tell that he enjoys his food, and I related to that heavy. I will be doing for sure a book recipe or two from that in the future. Next up, I did A Sky Painted Gold. I was drawn to this one by its absolutely gorgeous cover. It's gonna pop up somewhere over here. It's just stunningly beautiful. It's blue and all gold, and I honestly want to buy it just for the cover, almost. It's so pretty. This was about a young woman who lives in, I want to say England? Sorry, I'm having a brain fart. I'm pretty sure it was England. And there's like an island off the coast, and on the island there's a wealthy family that has like a mansion out there. So she, when the tide is low, she wades out to the island and breaks into their house, wanders around, and then steals like apples from their apple tree. Eventually she gets caught, and instead of being punished, she actually gets invited into their home to befriend the sister. What follows is a summer of party after party. She's like kind of turned into a socialite, basically. They start introducing her to all of their socialite friends. They have all these wild parties, beach days. She's just constantly like wrapped up in this like Hollywood almost lifestyle. And there's a little bit of romance tied in, but the romance isn't like the heavy focus of the story. I feel like it's more friendship, found family sort of a book. It was enjoyable. It got a little slow in parts and a little repetitive as well. I think it could have been trimmed down a bit, but overall it was an enjoyable light read. Then we did a Spindle Splintered by Alexi Haro. This was my shortest read of the month, 128 pages. This is a Sleeping Beauty retell, and what I really loved about this is it's not your typical retell. It does have Sleeping Beauty vibes, but it's kind of its own story in its own right. It talks about like multiple universes and alternate universes, and it is sapphic, and I like it a lot. It turned kind of the typical fairy tale upside down. There's going to be a second book coming out this year, I believe, called A Mirror Mended, which I think is going to cover another one of the fairy tales, and I can't wait to see what she does with this. And then look at how beautiful this cover is. It's just so pretty. And I think I showed this in the beginning of the month when I was creating this TBR, but like there's illustrations throughout. So it's just, I mean, it adds so much character to this book. I really love this one. And then Anxious People by Frederick Backman. I had never read anything by Frederick Backman before. I've heard that his writing is really good. I've been seeing Anxious People pop up. I had it on my library list, and so I went ahead with it. This book for me was interesting. It started out really frustrating, but I think it's supposed to be frustrating. The characters initially are so unaware of the things going on around them. They're so self-centered, kind of stupid, some of them, and they're all forced into this apartment together, or this house together. They're there for a viewing, and a bank robbery happens, and the robber ends up in the house, and because of this, they're kind of all forced to work together. And I thought the ending was maybe a little hokey or cliche, but overall I like this message of how things bring people together. Definitely worth a read. I've heard some of his other books are better, so I'll be checking some of them out in the future. The Starlight C. This was the book I was the most nervous about reading, and that's because The Night Circus, as I've said many times before, was one of my absolute favorite books of all time. And I've been seeing a lot that people that like The Night Circus don't like The Starlight C. I am neither here nor there on it. Like, I didn't love The Starlight C as much as I love The Night Circus, but I also didn't hate it. I just thought it was very different. If I had read this and not known it was Erin Morgenstern, I don't think I would have guessed that it was her. This follows Zachary Ezra Rollins, and he gets kind of involved with this magical underground library and world, and kind of gets put into a position where he has to protect it. He makes friends with a couple people, falls in love with someone, and there's this mysterious person that's trying to destroy all of the entryways so that nobody can get into this mysterious library. It is quite the epic adventure. I love all the literary references that are in it. I think that the characters are interesting. The overall concept is interesting. My main complaint with this is that it's confusing. There's a lot going on. It is so many plot lines, so many story points. I almost felt like I needed to make a spreadsheet to keep track at certain points. Eventually it kind of comes together and simplifies, but especially in the beginning, while you're starting to learn everybody in the system and you're kind of starting to piece everything together, it's pretty complex. So yeah, that's really my only complaint. And so I found that this wasn't one of those reads where you can just kind of read it and enjoy it. I really had to be focused on it when I was reading it. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just different. Next on the 4-star list was Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey. It was also on my holds list and one that I had heard a lot about. I actually listened to this one on audiobook. I had been told ahead of time to listen to it on audiobook because Matthew McConaughey narrates it himself. I definitely agree with that recommendation. It adds so much character to it listening to the story in his own words. I have complicated feelings about some of the things in his story. There's lots of parts that I love and lots of parts that I feel like are very much Matthew McConaughey in terms of what I see him as in Hollywood. But the way that he talks about his family growing up, and particularly the relationship between his parents, it's very difficult to listen to and very difficult to listen to him rationalize it, especially. His parents have what is very clearly a abusive relationship. There's massive domestic abuse between mom and dad, and he explains a lot of it away. He's just kind of oh, that's mom and dad, they love each other, they threaten to stab each other and then bang on the kitchen floor, and I feel like he doesn't really acknowledge how toxic it is, and that was kind of cringeworthy for me. And I'm not telling people how they have to perceive the things that they're being, have been through. Certainly if he doesn't feel like it was toxic and bad, then I can't tell him that he needs to feel that way. But I guess it worries me that people listening to it that might have been through things similar or might go through things similar might look at it and be like, oh, well, this isn't anything to be stressed about. This isn't anything to be worried about, because he's kind of so light about it. I don't know how to explain it really in any depth. I did really love a lot of the story though. I really appreciated his trip to Australia. He talks about being an exchange student in Australia and how resilient he was in the face of some adversity there. I think the part that really shined for me was when he met his wife Camilla and talking about their relationship and becoming a father. I thought that was very, very poignant. Overall, it's a really, really well done autobiography, and like I said, I think listening to him narrate it himself really adds to it. So I would definitely recommend that. And then next up are 2 younger kids books as well, which is kind of funny because like I said, I don't usually read too many kids books, but I had a bit of a nostalgia kick. I had one on my TBR already, and then I saw this one come up for audiobook, and I thought I would just go ahead and read it or listen to it, while I was doing dishes or something. And I'm so glad I did. It was such a nice trip down memory lane. And that was the Phantom Tollbooth. I listened to that one afternoon while I was cleaning the house and doing some household stuff. It was so enjoyable. I remember loving this book when I was a kid, and I honestly, for the life of me, couldn't remember that many details about the story. I remembered it had to do with words. I remembered it had to do with math and things like that, but I didn't really remember much outside of it. And it's about a young boy who's not interested in learning, he's bored, doesn't see the value of numbers or words or anything. And then this mysterious toll booth shows up in his room, and he goes through the toll booth and ends up on this journey around this magical country. And he has a watchdog, who's literally a dog with a watch in his chest, who accompanies him to all these different places, and he learns new vocabulary, learns the value of math, and he settles some disputes. And then he comes back excited about learning. And for me, it just was very sweet. Like, obviously it's not geared towards someone my age, it's geared towards someone that's much, much younger, but it just, I don't know, it made me feel childlike almost. It was so nice remembering what I loved about that story. And definitely, if you have little ones, it's one that should go on the TBR for them, I think. And finally, I read Ms. Peregrine's School for Peculiar Children. This is a book that has been around for a while and been made into movies. I have seen bits and pieces of the movies, but I've never watched the whole thing nor read this. And I'm really glad I did. This was very enjoyable as well. Very pleasantly surprised with this. It was about a young man who finds his way to this hidden school for peculiar children, and he makes friends with all of these different peculiar children, and then finds out that their world is threatened, and he kind of holds the key to protecting them. And he has to kind of decide what he wants to do with it. And it was really enjoyable, very interesting, kind of a unique plot. I mean, in some ways, you know, it reminds me of X-Men a little bit, because you have a school with a bunch of magical kids, but it didn't really remind me of X-Men at all, in that the plot's completely different, and they're not superheroes out fighting, they're like children at school that need to be protected. And yeah, it's just a really enjoyable book. I think that this was probably like the second or third to last book that I read this month, and it was a good way to finish. I think with all the heavy fantasy reading that I've done, this was nice to just like enjoy something easy and fun. Now I have to go find all the other books in the series and read them. And finally, the 5-star books. I had 5 5-star books in January, which was so exciting for me. It is great when you get a lot of 5 stars. I started this month out with a killer book. My very first read of the month was Braiding Sweetgrass. It was also on a holds list. I'd been waiting for it for a long time. I know I was supposed to be reading fantasy, but I was like, you know what? I can't pass this one up. And I'm glad, honestly, that I didn't. It was so good. So good. So interesting. And I actually even paired it in with the audiobook, so I would like read parts of it and listen to the audiobook and parts of it. And the audiobook was so good because the author narrates it herself. And there's this fusion of modern botany with native beliefs, and that was just so fascinating. The author, Robin, she talks about going to school to become a botanist, and she brings with her all these native beliefs and how traditional academics are like, oh, there's no value in those native beliefs. These questions that you have are not valid. Like, she talks about at one point how there's like a blue plant that grows next to a purple plant, and she always wondered like if there was a reason that those two colored plants grow next to each other. And the academics are like, oh, that's nonsense. There's no reason that, you know, purple and blue grow next to each other. But when she started researching it, she did actually find that there was reasons that they grow next to each other. She found out that there was symbiotic relationships between the sweetgrass and the native cultures, all sorts of really different interesting things. It also goes into land restoration, land reclamation. She talks about like land being stolen from indigenous tribes and it being restored, all sorts of different stuff, memories of growing up, memories of different students and theses. It's just full of so much information. And it's funny because like I've recommended this to a couple people now, and everybody's kind of like, well, I don't really have an interest in botany. I don't really want to read a nonfiction book about flowers and plants. And I'm like, but it's just so much more than that. It is about botany, and it is about nature, and it is nonfiction, but it's presented in a way where it feels like you're listening to a story. I mean, she's just such a good storyteller that she makes all of this stuff so relatable and interesting. And honestly, the messaging in it is so poignant and necessary. There's a lot that we could learn from this particular book. You know, learn how to be better stewards of the land that we live on, learn to be more intuitive with nature, more connected to nature, learn to understand the resources and how they've developed and things like that. I think there was so much value in it. I'm so glad that I ended up reading this one. Definitely my favorite book of the month. Highly, highly recommend it. After that, I read A History of Wild Places. History of Wild Places by Shea Earnshaw. This one was excellent as well. This was one of my book of the month picks, and it was so good. It lived up to the hype. This is a psychological thriller / magical realism kind of a book. There is a famous author who goes missing after a scandal. A man named Travis Wren is sent after her to find her, and he wanders out into the forest, and he also disappears. And then simultaneously there's a cult, and it follows a couple of the characters within the cult in their day-to-day life. There's a sickness in the woods that's keeping them from going outside of their cult boundaries. And it's really interesting. I will say I did figure out the plot twist before the end of the book, but, and this is the caveat, because usually that ruins books for me. Usually, I judge a psychological thriller on if I figured it out or not. But this one wasn't ruined by me knowing what the plot twist was going to be. It was still really, really good. I still really enjoyed where it went, even though I was able to predict some of it. It's just the writing is so beautiful and picturesque and immersive. I highly recommend this one. Another 5-star read for me was Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This was one that I also found in a little free library. Same thing, it's missing its jacket, but otherwise in good condition. So I didn't know that much about this book. I had heard that it was a winner of the book of the year from book of the month. I heard that it won Goodreads awards for fantasy, got nominated on a whole bunch of lists, so I thought I would check it out. It is a book set in, I want to say, Eastern Europe. The characters there's a lot of characters. So there's a set of siblings that are in one family. There's another girl in one family, and then there's a third girl in another family. And the three women are the principal characters. So there's they kind of all come together in very interesting ways. There's a magical race that lives out in the woods. They're kind of like elves, basically, the Starlight, and they're frozen, cold, wintry creatures. And the humans fear them basically because they kill, and they're, murderous and dangerous, and they don't allow humans in the wood to hunt, all sorts of different stuff. So initially there's this legend around them, and they're very scary. And then the Stark come to town, and it's kind of about how these three different characters deal with the Stark and the Stark legend and the silver that they use for coin and all sorts of different stuff. It's kind of a Rumpelstiltskin retelling, but only in the vaguest of senses. There's no little Rumpelstiltskin character. There's no spinning silver into gold or anything like that. It's just there's some touches where you can tell that Rumpelstiltskin was the inspiration, but it's not a literal translation. I really enjoyed this. I thought that all three of the female characters in this were super badass in very different ways. I appreciated each one of them. I love it when an author can write a good female character. So it was in this book, the thing that I really liked is that all three of these characters were different. They were all tough and smart and clever, but in different ways. They had different strengths, and together they worked better than by themselves. And they were so relatable. I found that I could read each character and go, I could see bits and pieces of myself or bits and pieces of friends in these female characters. So it was really good. Highly, highly recommend. And then another book I'm super excited is in the 5-star category is The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina by Zoraida Cordova. I don't know why I put this book off for so long, but I absolutely loved it. It's more magical realism than fantasy. Orquídea Divina is dying, and she invites her relatives out to her, all her children and grandchildren and stuff, to kind of make peace and accept the parts of their will. So they arrive, and she's still alive, and she is turning into a tree. And it's kind of funny because all of them thought she was just a crazy old woman. She's tried to explain to them that she's magic before, and nobody really believes her. They just think she's eccentric and weird. So when they get there and find out that she's turning into a tree, it's a pretty big shock to everybody. And there's a couple immediate relatives that stay and kind of work out this mystery, and then things start to happen, and it forces a few of them to go back to Ecuador, where Orquídea is from, and learn about her roots and her history. What follows is such a magical, beautiful story. I really enjoyed it. This was every bit as good as I hoped it would be. I will say, just a heads up, if you're like weird about sexual content, there is a little bit of sexual content in here. Nothing like pornographic necessarily, but there's like 1 or 2 sex scenes that are actually described in, you know, reasonable detail. So if that's something that bothers you, know that it's there. But otherwise, I mean, this was such a good story, so beautifully written, and I cannot wait to check out some other books by Zoraida Cordova now. And finally, the other book in my 5-star category was a book that I buddy read. I'm not sure why I don't have it sitting here because I actually do own a copy of it, but it's On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. I buddy read this with my friend Anna at The Sustainable Reader. You'll find her link over here, or not her link, but her handle if you want to check her out. She is an excellent account to follow on Instagram. She does a lot of books by POC authors. She's really into romance, but she tries to not read all of the same romance over and over again. And she has a really cool Etsy account. Awesome person. So go check her out. Anyways, she and I buddy read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This is a shorter book, and it is probably the most unique book that I read this month. It is written in a very... Well, first of all, it's written like a letter to his mom. So the whole story is told as if he's speaking directly to his mom. And it's very poetic and descriptive and beautiful, but also just incredibly tragic. His mother and grandmother were immigrants from Vietnam, post-Vietnam War, and they come bearing a ton of baggage. They're dealing with post-traumatic stress, dealing with the guilt and the shame of some of the choices that they made to survive the war. They get here, they receive no help. They're pretty much just dropped in an area where there's not a lot of Vietnamese people. They don't speak the language. They don't have the resources to deal with things. And Ocean, at a very young age, becomes the person that has to translate, has to figure out this new world, has to negotiate everything. And so there's a lot of his experience in that way, but there's also experience with him dealing with his sexuality. He comes to realize that he's gay, and you know, he's already picked on and emasculated because he is a smaller Asian man or boy in the book. But then, you know, people are teasing him because of his sexuality and things. And then even his like coming to terms with sexuality, his growing up and his first relationships and things like that. It's just unflinching in the things that are deep and traumatic, but just so poignant and beautiful. I think it's one of those things that is like a must read. It will make you feel so much emotionally, and it hopefully would make you feel more compassionate towards people that immigrate here. If you didn't grow up in an area where there is lots of people that have immigrated, this is maybe a story that might make you understand why people come here and what they go through after they get here. Even as somebody who grew up on a border town where there was lots of immigrants, it still made me just go, oh my god, the things that people go through. It made me even like look at things and realize like, wow, we just don't even really consider everything that people go through with immigration. It was a fantastic story. Highly recommend. Definitely a sadder story though, so if you're gonna read it, have your blanket, your fuzzy slippers, and your hot cocoa. You'll definitely need them. So that's all the books that I read. Like I said, my least favorite of the month was Shatter Me. My favorite was Braiding Sweetgrass. And so going into February, I think I have a good idea of what I want to do to tweak things and be more effective in reading the books from my actual TBR. Anyways, if you like this video, hit that thumbs up button and comment down below what was your favorite book of January? What was your least favorite book of January? Did you have anything that really surprised you? Either way, positive or negative. What about how many books you read? All the stats. Talk to me about your books. And if you're not already subscribed, hit the subscribe button, and I will see you in the next video. Have a good night. Bye.